This episode of the Creep Street Podcast is brought to you by Martini Coffee Roasters. You know, people always look at me weird when I say I start off every morning with a big old martini. But then I set them straight, and I tell them I'm talking about Martini Coffee Roasters coffee. A delicious coffee made by the Martini family. They roast their coffee using a traditional method of sight and sound to roast those little babies to perfection. And they also sell green coffee beans for those home roasters out there. And right now, fans of the Creep Street Podcast can get 20% off their entire order by using the code CREEPSTREET at martinicoffee.com. Once again, for 20% off your order, use the code CREEPSTREET at martinicoffee.com. Martini Coffee Roasters, the perfect coffee to keep you creeps caffeinated.
You've taken a wrong turn down Creep Street.
Citizens of the Milky Way, this is Maureen Bogey.
And this is Dylan Hackworth.
And you are listening to the Creep Street Podcast.
Ooh, that's gotta feel good.
It sure does, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us here today. It means the world to have you with us, and we are so happy to be on this ride together.
Oh, yeah.
Please remember to like, rate, subscribe, tell a friend, share us on social media. These little things really help the podcast out, and if you're a fan, we would so appreciate it.
Yes, please.
You can follow us on Instagram at Creep Street Podcast, Twitter at Creep Street Pod. We're on TikTok as well, and we're also on Facebook. And on our Facebook, we have a subgroup called Citizens of the Milky Way, where anyone can just chat, share memes, share articles, anything like that. It really is a blast, so I highly recommend you check that out.
Oh, yeah.
But here's the thing. Citizens, we know once a week is not enough for you.
Let's not pretend.
We just know this, okay? So we have the solution. It's at patreon.com/creepstreetpodcast. There you can access all sorts of great bonus content. We have 3 separate tiers starting at just $2 a month. And for just those $2 a month, you can get great bonus episodes as well as other fun bonus goodies on there. Anything ranging from full bonus episodes to short stories to movie commentary to movie reviews. So much fun stuff on there. We highly recommend you check that out as well. Once again, that's patreon.com/creepstreetpodcast.
Check it out.
Okay, Dylan. Last week, we got there with Lizzie Borden.
Oh, we got there.
We really went for it. It was a big episode. It was a fun episode. Well, not fun, but you know what I mean.
Oh, yeah.
And we got a lot of great feedback about it. Thank you so much for listening and for enjoying that episode. And I think it seems like we have most people that we have checked in with seem to think that Lizzie Borden did do it. However, not everyone thinks that.
Right.
There is a good chunk of people who do not subscribe to that theory, which we love.
Right.
We love it when these kind of things happen. So please let us know, who do you think committed these murders, and we'll keep you updated on the stats we get back from you guys.
Absolutely. And who knows if your opinion might change after today's episode.
Exactly. Dylan, tell the good people, tell the citizens what we are doing today.
Today's episode is Lizzie Borden, The Haunting. That's right. When you have a murder most foul, it means ghosts are on the prowl.
Mm-hmm.
And let me real quick give you these sources of mine. First, a book called The Ghost Chronicles. A medium and a paranormal scientist investigate 17 true hauntings by Maureen Wood and Ron Kolick. A documentary called The Curse of Lizzie Borden on Discovery Plus. An article called Eliza Borden and the Children in the Well by Amber at bostonghost.com. The official Lizzie Borden bed and breakfast website, lizzie-borden.com, and just a little smattering of Wikipedia where it was needed.
Thank you, Dylan. Wow. Okay. So this is an interesting aspect of the Lizzie Borden case that we did not touch on last week because we wanted to really get the bones set.
Oh, yeah.
Before we kind of jellied it up.
Oh, yeah, that's
not a thing. I just made that up. But you guys understand what I'm going for.
That's right.
So, Dylan, what the actual hell is going on?
Well, last week, as we know, we covered the iconic Borden Family Murders, which are still as famous today as they were back in 1892. And of course, when something that awful happens, it's no surprise that many say it was followed by a haunting. But depending on who you ask, there was something evil and inhuman stalking the Bordens even before the murders. But let's start off with the basics. Today, the Borden home can still be found in Fall River, Massachusetts, located at 232nd Street. Today, it operates as a bed and breakfast and a little museum, and folks who visit the place report all manner of strange phenomenon that include impressions on the beds as if an invisible body is laying there. Orbs, rods, strange mists, as well as disembodied voices, and even the feeling of being watched and even touched. Also, it should be stated that while the focus is on the actual murder house, an often overlooked location that is said to also have supernatural activity going on within it is the Maplecroft Mansion, the home that Lizzie and her sister Emma bought and moved into after the murders.
Yes, we didn't really touch on this home that much in last week's episode because last week was mainly just about the murders, but I think that totally makes sense that there would be maybe some sort of activity at that home as well.
Right.
Lizzie lived there for a long time, probably like her safe haven. You know, she wanted this home for so long. So I don't know. It makes sense to me.
She wanted that home so bad that she remained in a town where a lot of the folks thought she was a killer.
Right.
You know what I mean?
She could have she had enough money to move to any city. I mean, she loved Broadway. She could have moved to New York.
Right.
She could have moved anywhere, but she decided to stay in Fall River.
Now, as we know from last week, Emma at first was the sole inheritor of the Borden fortune until Lizzie was officially acquitted. And once she received her half of the fortune, and of course the two moved in to Maplecroft, located on the hill. Of course, that was the bougie side of Fall River. Something interesting to note, and I'm not sure if we mentioned it last week, but after the trial, while Lizzie did remain in town, she changed her name to Lisbeth.
Yes.
As a way of shedding the stigma attached to the name Lizzie Borden. Her gravestone actually reads Lisbeth. But she didn't change her name until 1905, roughly around the same time that Emma moved out under mysterious circumstances.
Wow. So maybe something happened, so she really was just trying to
ditch the Lizzie thing.
Yeah, and just start anew.
Right, absolutely. Now, as you can imagine, Maplecroft was a big step up from the modest duplex that the Bordens lived in. This new house had 7 bedrooms, 3.5 baths, and while Lizzie and Emma certainly didn't have many close friends, especially after the murders, it's said they often threw lavish themed parties.
Oh.
And were incredible entertainers for those who would actually come. Which is interesting.
Yeah.
Because it's also said she lived a very secluded life, even after the murders, away from the townspeople and all that stuff. And she lived that way until she died. It reminds me of Jay Gatsby from The Great Gatsby. This, even though that's fiction, it was this guy who would host these huge lavish parties but wouldn't actually attend. He would be hidden away somewhere in his big mansion. And as we know last week, the sisters lived there for 12 years until Emma one day up and left, moving to New Hampshire, and the sisters never spoke to each other again, and only they know the reasons why. Well, Lizzie died of pneumonia in her home, Maplecroft, at the age of 66. And as we said last week, her sister Emma would die only 9 days after Lizzie. But here's what's interesting. On the day that Lizzie died, Emma fell and broke her hip. And she died 9 days later due to infection and various complications with that injury. Interesting to note that on the same day Lizzie dies, she had her accident that would ultimately kill her.
Yeah, that's so weird.
Many say that Lizzie had told Emma that whenever the day came that she died, Emma would die shortly after as a way of keeping the truth hidden. But obviously that's all legend and hearsay.
Right. Who knows, man?
Who knows what's actually true? But what's interesting is that when Lizzie died, invites were sent out to folks to attend the funeral. And the attendees got their invites and indeed even came to attend, but for some reason, the date, I guess, listed on the invite was wrong.
Oh, God.
And Lizzie was buried on a different day, which is just weird. Well, the ghosts of both Lizzie and Emma have reportedly been seen at Maplecroft and the murder house. This has caused many to wonder why she would want to return to the murder house. So it's no surprise why she'd want to haunt Maplecroft, but why the murder house? So for this story, I'm going to be focusing on one investigation in particular. The main one is from the book I referenced, Ghost Chronicles. So let's just start off, because this is written by the team that investigated it, so I'm going to be saying their names a lot. So just before we get started, I'll read to you every person and their role in this group. There was Ron Kolick, one of the authors of the book. He was lead investigator. Maureen Wood, the other author of the book. She is a trance medium. Ron Jr., who is Ron Kolick's son, who is an investigator. Jim, an EVP specialist. Gavin Cromwell, a Welsh psychic. Martin, who is Gavin's manager. Byron, a UK investigator from the group Haunted Devon. I think we've even referenced their research before.
Yeah, I think we have too.
And Pippa, a BBC correspondent. Also in attendance were Leanne, the owner, and Emily, who was a tour guide. Now, the book was published in 2009. Leanne and Emily, I have no idea if they're still affiliated with the Borden house, but anyway, at the time they were. And keep in mind, like I said, Maureen is what they call a trance medium. And there's, of course, many different kinds of mediums, which would actually make for an excellent show one day. Here's the definition for trance medium, and I pulled it right from Wikipedia. A trance mediumship is often seen as a form of mental mediumship. Most trance mediums remain conscious during a communication period, wherein a spirit uses the medium's mind to communicate. The spirit or spirits using the medium's mind influences the mind with the thoughts being conveyed. The medium allows the ego to step aside for the message to be delivered. At the same time, one has awareness of the thoughts coming through and may even influence the message with one's own bias. Such a trance is not to be confused with sleepwalking, as patterns are entirely different. So just a little definition of what that means. And I'm sure it means different things to different people, obviously, but that's just sort of the broad general meaning. So the team pulls up to the murder house, and right away, both the mediums, Gavin and Maureen, can begin to feel something strange. According to the source, the mediums in the group had little knowledge of the place. For example, Maureen, the trance medium, was actually from Massachusetts, so she knew more than Gavin did, who was from Wales. She knew the names of the family members, but didn't know where in the house they were actually murdered, and Gavin didn't know names or locations, anything like that. Gavin said right away he felt like where they had parked their car must be where once stood a barn or a shed or something. And Maureen didn't sense anything about a barn, but she immediately got a sense of foreboding. And the group went inside and were introduced to Leanne, the owner of the house. And right away, Gavin could sense a strong, dark energy that seemed to be emanating from the basement. Few steps into the hallway, they passed by the open door that led to the basement, and Maureen likewise was hit with this sense of dread, and they quickly walked by it and made their way to the kitchen. And once in the kitchen, Gavin began to sense a presence with him. A feminine presence that he believed was named Abby. While Maureen, she knew that Abby was, of course, the wife of Andrew Borden and one of the victims, but she kept quiet as she didn't want that to influence his investigation. This is when suddenly Maureen was overtaken by a strange feeling. It was as if someone who wasn't her was looking out through her eyes. She had already fallen into a sort of trance, and the team hadn't even set up yet. The group could immediately sense that something was wrong with Maureen, and as Ron approached her and touched her elbow, she jerked away, shouting, "Don't touch me." Inside of her were feelings of rage and repulsion. A decorative hatchet lay in a basket nearby, and all she could think of doing was grabbing that hatchet and sinking it right into Ron's head. But she resisted and called out for everyone to step back. After several moments, she was able to regain a little bit of control, and the group helped her outside, and the blast of cool air kind of helped her get her senses back and whatnot. A thing to keep in mind is that Maureen is also an empath and claims to actually feel what the spirits want her to feel. And when they were back inside, they went into the parlor, and she was overcome with a piercing pain in her head, like it was being split open. And that's when they noticed the framed crime scene photo on the mantle. Of course, we know Andrew Borden was murdered in the parlor laying on the couch. He was taking a nap. So this explained probably the pain she was feeling in her head. And they asked is this the same couch that was in the parlor that Andrew was murdered on? And Leanne actually said no. She had found someone on eBay who had made an identical replica.
Oh, wow.
And a side note, apparently the place has been refurbished to look pretty much exactly as it did in Lizzie's day.
Wow.
So something interesting to just note.
I know. I kind of want to go there, but I'm also scared.
I know, right? I know. They could sense then a male presence in the room, but here's what's interesting. Gavin said the presence he was feeling was most likely Andrew Borden, but that it was merely a residual presence, and that he believes Andrew Borden himself is not actually haunting the house. And here's something else that Gavin sensed, which kind of contradicts what we know about the murders. He said he believed the killer entered through the kitchen to the parlor, which is entirely possible, but that it was a male energy. He also felt that Andrew's murder came first and Abby's second. And he also felt that Lizzie was a lesbian as well, which obviously, who knows?
Yeah, that comes up so much about Lizzie possibly being a lesbian. Like, that's just...
Right.
But I don't know if that's really was anything that anyone thought of at the time.
Right, I mean...
Or if that's just something that later on people have...
Yeah.
Because just the fact that she didn't get married doesn't mean...
Right.
That she was a lesbian. There were so many lesbians back then that got married.
Right.
It's like just because she was a lesbian doesn't mean she wouldn't get married, that you just got married.
Right, exactly. So they ventured into the next room, and I'm guessing this was perhaps some sort of like a living room or something, as Gavin sensed that this was a place where folks would often socialize. And that's when he turned and peered out a window. He said that a female presence would often come and peer in the windows. He didn't sense that she was related to the Bordens, but rather maybe a close acquaintance. His exact quote was, "I sense a female spirit who comes to the house and peers in. She's an acquaintance of the Bordens. She comes to the house often, but can't or won't come in. That's all I'm getting in this room." So, a female presence that comes to the windows and looks in, but for whatever reason, can't or either won't enter the house. Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, now they decide to head up to the third floor, where right away they notice a strange, almost antiseptic smell. The best they could describe it was almost like a hospital smell. So they pulled out a UV light to check for any blood or bodily fluids, but obviously weren't able to find any. But that's when Gavin felt a presence enter the room. It was a feminine presence, and a name started to come to him, the name Sullivan. And as we know, the family's maid, her name was Bridget Sullivan, or Maggie Sullivan, as the Bordens called her, because they didn't want to take the time to actually learn her fucking name. That's when Maureen began to feel the sensation of being sick. But it wasn't coming from this Sullivan woman. Gavin then pointed out that he felt that this Sullivan presence was a servant. Bingo, we know she was a maid. And that's when they realized that while Sullivan was definitely attached to the Bordens, this sickness sensation was perhaps coming from a haunting that came later in time. As we know, others have lived in this house since the Bordens.
Right.
And they don't really follow up on that because they're pretty sure that feeling might have come from a different era.
Interesting. Weird.
So once the mediums got accustomed to this atmosphere, they decided to start an EVP session. And they placed a recorder on the bed, and Maureen took a seat next to the bed. And they began asking it questions. Is there anyone here with us? Would you like to communicate, etc.? All they heard in return was silence. But then Ron saw a shadow dart across the bed. It was a quick-moving shadow, but not like a person, almost like an animal.
Ooh.
Interesting thing to note, it's apparently often reported a spectral cat being sighted by folks staying at the bed and breakfast.
Hello, we've talked about black cats
Yes,
before
we
in some of our Shadow People episodes.
Oh, very good point. I didn't even think about that. Yes, because if this
Shadow
is a place
cats.
of negative vibes, they might come to feed.
Right.
And
when I said black cats, I meant literally black shadow cats, not just cats that have black fur.
Right. During the questioning, Maureen had a sensation that there was a presence with them that was trying to speak but either couldn't or was deciding not to for some reason. So they made their way to the adjacent room, and here the sense of anxiety was not as pronounced as it felt in the other room, but this room felt different. That's when Gavin began to see a name forming in his mind, a name that was attached to the name Sullivan. He kept getting Mary or Martha, but he wasn't sure what it was, just that it was attached to the name Sullivan. As we know, the maid was often called Maggie by the Bordens, even though her name was Bridget. They got the sense that this presence was a bit annoyed by them. Not angry or rageful, but annoyed, as if it felt like people were talking about her. They began to ask the presence questions to see if she would communicate, and Maureen started to feel a tingling sensation, which to her seemed to mean that the presence was nervous if it could trust these people. They began to smell a unique odor, but not the antiseptic smell that they smelled in the other room. This was a combination of rose and baby powder. And apparently back in the day, folks often used a sort of rose powder to dust with.
Oh.
And it would make sense, hey, if the maid's ghost is there, it might smell like something she often used in her daily work, you know.
Totally. That's something we talked about that too in our Ghosts of the White House episode.
Yes,
where
absolutely.
Smells are often a huge indicator of a haunting.
Absolutely. Good point. Well, one of the crew was looking about the room with a flashlight when he found an old steamer trunk, and labeled on the front of this trunk was the name Bridget Sullivan. Boom. That's when the whole Sullivan thing came full circle. And the moment they found the name on the trunk, the presence in the room seemed to dissipate as if the spirit left. Who knows what that means, but one could argue that perhaps Bridget Sullivan was unhappy that they kept calling her Mary, Martha, Maggie, or whatever, and wanted her real name to be known.
I mean, it makes sense. I can't believe they fucking called her Maggie.
Right, and I don't think when it says it leaves like it crossed over and it left, it was like it was saying like, okay, good, now I'm going to bed or whatever.
Right,
like
right.
So they leave the room and they realize that much of the heavy energy that was permeating this top floor was kind of dissipated altogether. So Leanne led them back down the hall to another room at the end of the hall that they hadn't entered yet. This is often called the Morse Room because this is where Andrew's brother, John V. Morse, was staying when the murders happened. Now, the two mediums entered the room and immediately felt a presence surround them. Gavin and Maureen reached out and took each other's hands to focus on what this presence was trying to communicate to them. What happened next was what Maureen could only describe as losing complete control of herself. It was as if the world began spinning. Her consciousness faded to the background. It had become clear to the rest of the crew that this presence was going to speak through Maureen. They started with the usual questions. Who's with us? Would you like to communicate? Etc. Maureen briefly made eye contact with Ron, who claimed her eyes were no longer Maureen's, but someone else's. She closed her eyes again and breathed deeply, and that's when a raspy voice that wasn't Maureen's came from her mouth, and it said, "Dirty girl."
What in the fuck?
So of course they asked, who are we speaking with? And the voice replied,
Abigail.
Next, they asked her if she had anything to tell them, and in that raspy voice, she replied,
Never turn your back in this house.
Oh,
They asked Abigail why she was still at the house, and the raspy voice replied,
I can't leave.
But when they asked if she wanted to leave, her head shook from side to side, indicating no. Maureen began to rock back and forth as if she was going to collapse, so they held her and tried to steady her. And this is what happened next. I'm reading this right from the source. Her breathing stopped for a mere moment as an inaudible gasp escaped her lips. Abigail, I repeated, why can't you leave? Agitated, Maureen drew a long, agonizing breath, tearing away from my grasp. She retreated backwards, mere inches from the wall, doubling over. Her body rocked up and down. She expelled a sudden, high-pitched moan, obliterating the growing murmurs of the onlookers. Just then her body stiffened. Her eyes were engaged one moment and haunted the next, as if vanishing behind a mask. The entity had taken control. Maureen was gone. Abigail? Abigail! She turned on her side. Her body writhed in pain. She coughed, choked. Wet, gurgling sounds emanated from deep within her throat, as if she was vomiting. Violently, she dropped to the floor, screaming, kicking, gagging as retching sounds continued to spew forth. Reacting quickly, I tossed the microphone on the bed and dove to the floor. I grabbed her flailing legs. My only reward was a kick to the groin. I gritted my teeth as I heard her head slam against the wall. I reached for her legs once again, pulling her away. Leaning my weight on her, I screamed, Maureen! Maureen! Still gurgling, gagging, spewing. To all in the room, she sounded as if she were puking. Where's the light? Get the flashlight over there, Ron Jr. cried out from the back of the room. "No, we're using infrared. It could screw him up," I commanded. Maureen whimpered as I continued to wrestle with her convulsing body. "Maureen, Maureen," I repeated as I placed my hand on the side of her head. "Abigail, leave. Leave this body. It is not yours," I repeated. "Leave this body. It's not yours." Maureen's body went limp for a fraction of a second. Wow, okay.
Shit. Okay, so very intense stuff going on here.
Very intense stuff. And when Maureen regained consciousness, she screamed for everyone to get off of her. She began sobbing and clutching her head, saying that there was this intense pain in her head. And after a while, the pain subsided and Maureen was able to, compose herself. And that's when they realized that the place where Maureen fell was right where Abby Borden's body was found.
Oh, God.
Maureen decided to take off after that experience. And after Maureen left, a woman named Emily arrived. She worked at the bed and breakfast as a tour guide. Their next mission was to visit that dreaded basement with Gavin. But strangely enough, when they got down there, the dark energy they felt when they first arrived had all but dissipated now. Funny enough, Gavin did pick up a little something. He saw in his mind the image of a coffin, and with a chuckle, Emily led them over to a part of the basement that they used for storage to reveal a pine wood coffin. But this wasn't a real coffin, it was something they used for decoration around Halloween, but still interesting that he could sense it.
Yeah, wow.
So the group returned upstairs to the parlor to congregate and plan their next move. They decided their next move was to perform an old technique called table tilting. Now, table tilting was a method employed by spiritualists in the 1900s as a method of communicating with the other side. The living would sit around the table holding hands and attempt to communicate with the other side, and responses that folks would claim to get would be the table tilting or even levitating, in response to their questions. So Leanne went and brought up a small wooden octagonal-shaped table from the basement, and the group set it up in the parlor, and they sat all around it, holding hands. And when they began to call out to the spirits, they almost immediately got a reaction. The table would tilt and vibrate after questions were asked. They had a feeling that it was the spirit of Abby, and when they asked if it was Abby they were speaking to, the table rocked harder and began to creak and moan. Suddenly, an awful image began to materialize in Gavin's head. Abby was presenting herself to him, but not in her normal form, but in the form of her murdered body.
Oof.
And it was a grisly sight. The rocking of the table kept getting more intense. Pippa, one of the investigators, she was the one from BBC, she asked Abby, "Do you want us to know that Lizzie did this to you?" And that's when Ron interjected saying, Lizzie was acquitted of the murders by a jury. And just as he said that, the table stopped dead still.
Wow.
And there was a feeling in the air that Abby did not like that last remark. Hoping to salvage the moment, Pippa asked, "Abby, if Lizzie killed you, could you please make the table move again?" And the question had barely left her lips when the table began to shake with great intensity.
Yep.
Seeming to confirm that Lizzie had indeed murdered her. So interesting. Obviously, who knows, but
yeah,
still interesting.
I buy it. I'm buying it.
I'm going all in.
Going all in, baby.
Well, the group wanted to keep this line of communication going, and they came up with an idea. While the table tilting method seemed to be working, they wondered if making an entire table move, if it was requiring too much energy of the spirit. They didn't want her to get worn out. So they switched over to a method called glass swirling instead. And according to my source, glass swirling was a method introduced by the British, and it involves placing a glass upside down on a table. Each member places a finger on the glass. The spirit, using the energy of the group, moves the glass in response to questions. And as we know, a glass is often used as a planchette with spirit boards, but there's no spirit board involved. It's more just the motion of the glass, answering your questions.
Yeah.
They once again called out to Abby, asking if she would like to continue their communication, and immediately the glass slid across the table, seeming to indicate yes. So they started with a series of tests like, "Abby, which way is the church?" And the glass would move in the direction of the church. Then they said, "Can you show us where Dr. Bowen's house is?" And the glass moved in the direction of Dr. Bowen's house. And keep in mind that the group had no idea where these places in town were. Leanne, the owner of the bed and breakfast, was able to confirm that the glass was pointing in the right direction. But Gavin soon piped in saying that he was getting the vibe that Abby was getting tired of their direction questions. And he was also sensing that Abby did not feel accepted in her home when alive, which, as we know from last week's episode, she probably didn't feel accepted in her home. So they asked Abby a series of questions, and they were able to gather that the woman who comes to peer in the windows was actually Abby's sister. So not related to the Bordens by blood, related by marriage.
Got it. Okay.
When they asked if she liked the investigators visiting her house, she actually replied with a very ecstatic yes. And Gavin added that he feels as though she likes having investigators there because it gives her a chance to tell her story about what happened. They asked Abby if she was a religious person, and the glass sped up in its circular motion, indicating yes. And when they asked if she liked going to church, it spun even faster to the point that it tipped over and stopped. And right as it tipped over, in that brief moment of silence, the group heard the bells from the church chime 12 times. It was midnight.
Oh, God.
When they asked if it was true that Andrew Borden abused his children, the glass did not move, indicating no. And when they asked if Andrew was ever unfaithful, it also did not move. Leanne asked Abby if she liked the way that she kept up the house, and the response was yes. And when asked if she liked Leanne, the glass apparently circled so quickly that it fell off the table into Leanne's lap. So saying yes, she does like Leanne, which is kind of nice, I guess.
Yeah.
Now, Gavin, the medium, he could sense that Abby was growing tired. Not that she was tired of talking, but that the energy it was taking to communicate was wearing thin. So Gavin wanted to get in some last-minute questions, so he just came right out and asked Abby if she got along with Lizzie. And just then the glass jerked just a bit and stood rigidly still. This wasn't just a no, however. The vibe seemed to indicate that Abby was afraid to even answer. After that, it seems their communication with Abby was done. Interesting.
Wow.
Interesting that she seemed to, even after death, afraid to talk. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Like, what is that about?
Now, what's interesting is as the crew was breaking down their equipment and packing everything up, Ron was chatting with Leanne in the kitchen. And that's when he noticed a small cut on his hand. He had no idea how he had gotten it, but Ron had a first aid kit with him, and he put a bandage on the cut, and everyone said their goodbyes, and they were headed out, getting in their vehicles. Just as Ron was getting in his car, he noticed another cut on his hand that was gushing blood. Once again, he had no idea how it had happened or how he got this cut. And from what I can understand from the source, it seems like it didn't even really hurt either. So he went back to the Borden house, knocked on the door, and asked Leanne for a bandage, which she had. And so Ron cleaned up the wound and wrapped it, and then finally bid farewell to the Borden house. Now, this is interesting. At the end of the chapter, they made a summary of the results of their investigation. And so I'm going to read it verbatim in their own words. It's just a paragraph here. Results of the investigation. It was exciting to be able to arrange an investigation in such an infamous location for our foreign guests. The prevalent spirit of the night seemed to be that of Mrs. Abby Borden. Though most of our evidence was collected through spiritual methods such as trance channeling, glass swirling, and table tilting, the spirits were present nonetheless. Maureen's channeling revealed the pain of Abby's death and a glimpse of her killer, who Maureen believed was Lizzie. Gavin's insight into the death of Mr. Borden revealed a male accomplice. So, some people wondered, was it Morse? Was it his brother?
Right.
If that's true,
right.
if a man did it, would it possibly have been John Morse?
Or was he involved in some way? Maybe he didn't actually commit the crime, but maybe he was an accomplice or something to the crime with Lizzie. I don't know.
Yeah, very interesting. So, because it's interesting, our research last week seemed to indicate that either Lizzie acted alone, or if she did have an accomplice, it was perhaps Bridget Sullivan.
Right.
The maid. But interesting that their investigation seemed to indicate that Lizzie had a male accomplice who killed her father while she presumably killed the mother. Now, Gavin said he sensed that the man was killed first. And as we know, the forensics seem to indicate Abby died first. But we also know that mediumship isn't an exact practice. Remember, he kept getting the name Mary or Martha Sullivan, not Maggie Sullivan, but still pretty close. So who knows? Well, now I want to quickly just turn to our other source, the Discovery Plus documentary, The Curse of Lizzie Borden. Now, this doc has it's got a lot of the usual paranormal TV stuff. They investigate, spooky things happen, all that. But the main thesis of this documentary was that there was a demonic force following the Borden family long before the murders ever took place. And a large part of this doc, actually, it concerns a man named Sam Beltrusis, who apparently Beltrusis is a distant relative, I guess, to the Bordens, and he's a medium himself, and his goal has been to like end this family curse that he says has been like a plague to the family for many generations. Fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
But who knows? It doesn't really add much to this story so much. But what's fascinating is the history they dug up about the Borden family. Turns out they may have actually had many occult ties and accusations of witchcraft and even murder. The strangeness started with Lizzie's great uncle Ladwick Borden, who was born in 1812 to a Martha, Patty, and Richard Borden. Ladwick's brother Abraham was the father of Andrew Borden, so that's how they were related.
Right.
So her great uncle, obviously. In his life, Ladwick had 4 wives, which wasn't uncommon because, women obviously died during birth, stuff like that, so it wasn't uncommon for that to happen. His second wife is our person of interest, though, Eliza Darling Borden, and she is kind of the focus of this backstory. Well, after marrying Ladwick, the two of them had 3 children in pretty short succession. And while no one knows for sure what happened, it's suspected that perhaps Eliza was afflicted with some kind of a postpartum depression. At the age of 37, Eliza killed 2 of her 3 children by throwing them down a well.
Oh, God. Jesus.
She then returned to her home and in her bedroom cut her own throat with a razor. This was in 1848, 44 years before the infamous Borden Axe Murders. Apparently, John Morse had even often been accused of witchcraft numerous times in his life, though I can't really find any evidence of that. But it's interesting to wonder if there was something evil following the Bordens all along.
This case is crazy. So it makes you wonder, if Lizzie did do this, was she under the control of some other being or some other entity?
Right.
That forced her to do this, so it wasn't really her.
Right, almost like an Amityville thing or something, right? Like there was this pre-existing evil that, made Ronnie DeFeo kill his family and then almost made George Lutz kill his family.
Right,
yeah,
right.
Very, very, some fun things to think about. Obviously, who knows? There's no real way to prove that. I guess I shouldn't say fun things to think about, but there's obviously no way to prove that, but just interesting, kind of a dark history the Bordens had even before the infamous murders.
So please let us know what you think. Do you think that this curse had anything to do with it? Do you believe that the ghosts are still haunting the halls of the Lizzie Borden murder house as well as Maplecroft? Feel free to reach out to us on any of our socials or email us at creepstreetpodcast@gmail.com.
Oh, yes. And let me read to you some names that could give me 40 whacks any day of the week.
Oh, come on.
Of course, the Dream James Watkins, the Finnish-faced Via Lundqvist, the Madman Marcus Hall, the vivacious Vicky McHugh, the tenacious Teresa Hackworth, the Heartbreak Kid Chris Hackworth, the oh-so-suave Sean Richardson, the British Bonebreaker Bex Martin, the notorious Nicholas Barker, the terrifying Taylor Lashmet, the Count of Cool Cameron Corliss, the Archduke of Attitude Adam Archer, the sinister Sam Kiker, the Nightmare of New Zealand Noeline Vivilli, the loathsome Johnny Love, the carnivorous Kevin Bogey, the killer stud Carl Staub, the fire starter Heather Carter, the conqueror Christopher Damian Damaris, the awfully awesome Annie, the murderous Maggie Leach, the Sir of Sexy Sam Hackworth, the evil Elizabeth Riley, Lauren Hellfire Hernandez Lopez, and the maniacal Laura Maynard.
Thank you so much to all of our top-tier Patreon donors, as well as all of our Patreon donors. We are so grateful for you, and thank you so much for joining us on this crazy journey that we're on.
Absolutely. And of course, please like, rate, subscribe, tell your friends, tell your family, tell your loved ones, evangelize the good name of Creep Street. Citizens of the Milky Way, my name is Dylan Hackworth.
I'm Maureen Bogey.
Good night, and goodbye.
Goodbye.